Hello and welcome to Sci Cam episode 11. I'm Michael Conterio and joining me this episode is Sonia Dunbar.
Hello.
Sonia's going to be talking about plant mimicry later, but I'm going to start us off by giving you a beginner's guide to lasers. So everyone knows what lasers are. They're everywhere. They're laser cutters, DVD drives, light shows, military targeting, so many different uses. They've even been used to make optical tweezers, which is where you can actually move around tiny particles by using the laser light to push them around. So lasers have highly powered tight beams of light with very specific wavelengths. But how do they make such bright, uniform light? And the clue is in the name. Laser is actually an acronym, and it stands for Light Amplification by Stimulated Emission of Radiation. So what does that mean? It means that you actually have light trapped inside the laser, and the presence of this light causes what we call a gain medium inside the laser, which is actually kind of emitting the light, to emit even more light. And when it does that, it will always be the same color, it'll have the same frequency, the number of oscillations per second, the same wavelength, the same distance between the peaks and troughs in the electric and magnetic field of the light as the light that was already there. So you just get this process by which you just get brighter and brighter light. So let's look at that in a little bit more detail. And for that, we're going to have to just go back a little bit to the structure of what's actually in there. Inside all of the chemicals there, electrons live in specific energy levels. And if they're sat at a high energy level, and there's a gap at a low energy level that they can drop down into, then they can do that by giving out light. And they'll give out just a small amount of it, which we call a particle of light, or a photon. And this is random emission. He'll just do this at some point. We don't know when, we can't predict it. And the energy of the photon that is emitted equals the energy lost. And that determines the color of the light as well. Different chemicals have different gaps that these electrons can fall down. Sodium street lamps, for instance, have a gap which gives you that yellow light that you see. And you also have kind of like neon or xenon lights will give you different colors. They've got different energy gaps. But you can do the same thing in reverse. If you've got light of the right color corresponding to a photon of the energy of that gap, then if the electron's at the bottom, you can give it enough energy to push it up to the top, and that's called optical excitation. And one thing that's really cool about this is actually we use the fact that this happens to sometimes like measure what chemicals there are in a gas, say. And we call it this spectroscopy because, as we know, that gap is specific to the chemicals. And we've even managed to do this by looking at exoplanets. That's planets in other solar systems. And we can see in the light coming from the sun, the star of that solar system, when the planet just passes in front of it, the atmosphere of the planet absorbs some of the light, which corresponds to that energy gap of the chemicals inside the atmosphere. And so we can actually work out some of what the atmospheres are of planets light years away. I think that's very exciting. But that's not just what we're caring about when we're looking at lasers. There's one extra thing that can happen when light is shone into a chemical with the correct sized energy gap. What happens if the light is shone in that could excite an electron to a higher energy level, but instead there's already an electron at that higher energy level? Well, it turns out that not only can light not be absorbed because there's nowhere for that energy to go, but there's something strange that happens that was predicted by Albert Einstein in 1917. The presence of this light actually stimulates the emission of the light. It actually causes that electron to fall down from the higher energy level and give out another photon of light. And so that means you have these two photons of light now, both the same frequency, both the same color, and then obviously that's more intense than it was. That's like twice the intensity. But there's more than that you need for a laser. So in order to get to that really large intensities rather than just a couple of photons, which are really tiny amounts of light, we need a couple of things, and the first of which is a cavity. Now, strictly speaking, this isn't entirely necessary for a laser, but lasers that don't use this are very rare. So what happens inside the laser is it will have mirrors at either end, just making sure that the light will bounce back and forth. But the distance between them is chosen very carefully, so that the light bouncing back and forth, going directly between those two mirrors, will reinforce if it's of the color that is being produced inside the laser. And this means that you actually get all the laser light bouncing back and forth, very much all going in the same direction, rather than going off in lots of different angles. Because if it goes off in a different angle, it bounces off one of these mirrors, hits the side of the laser, and just gets absorbed by the side of the laser. So you end up with just lots of light going back and forth very, very straight, which is one of the reasons why lasers can have such tight beams. But there's one more thing that we need, and this is where all of the laser engineering really comes in. This is the thing that really makes lasers, and that's achieving what we call population inversion. Because if you imagine all of these energy levels, the high ones and the low ones for the electrons to be in, I've said that as well as being stimulated to drop down from the top to the bottom by the presence of light of the right color, the electrons can also just spontaneously do it randomly without anything else there. And so with all this combined, it means that if you want to get laser light to build up, you need to always make sure you have a nice supply of these electrons in the higher level. But if you try to just pump it really hard with a light that has that exact gap, then you'd push electrons up, but you'd also cause stimulated emission of them coming back down again, so you wouldn't really actually be getting anywhere. You wouldn't be increasing the overall intensity of light inside the laser. What we need is lots and lots of electrons in the higher energy levels and not very many in the lower energy levels, so that whenever we've got light just coming up to that electron, it will cause it stimulated emission, and we'll have to pump it some other way to get it to that. So what we do when we've got these lasers is we have 3 or 4 level systems. So in addition to these levels, which are actually giving us the light that we want, we'll have an extra level above it, and sometimes even an extra level below. And what these levels are there for is to provide a different energy gap, effectively, so that you can pump it. Because with the electrical pumping or optical pumping from another light, you can push an electron from that very bottommost level up to the top, and then basically you design your laser so that very quickly it goes from the very top level into the one that's actually going to give you the laser light. And then you have lots of them sat there, and eventually they all decay because of the stimulated emission and drop down. But in a 4-level laser, they then very quickly are removed from that, so there's no chance of them absorbing some of the light, because you don't want them to absorb some of the laser light that you're producing. You want to create more of it, not to lose it in the absorption. And so you need to have all these extra levels in order to maintain that population inversion. Otherwise, the best you can do is just actually worse than 50-50. So more than half the time, you'll actually be absorbing some of the laser light that you get rather than emitting it. And of course, as we've already said, to increase the intensity, we just want to keep emitting the light and not absorbing it. And then you may be wondering, what actually happens then? Well, the thing is, this cavity that I mentioned before isn't perfect. It's in fact got one of the mirrors slightly worse at reflecting light than the other one. And so this means that just a small portion of the light that hits that mirror actually comes out as a laser beam. And then generally there's a lens at the front of the laser in order to actually focus the light even more and keep that nice beam going. So there you go. It's simple. Well, maybe not. But they're simple enough now for them to be tiny and everywhere. So maybe next time you're sat in a boring presentation and someone gets out a laser pen to point at part of a slide, perhaps you could just consider all the strange goings-on happening inside the laser pen, with the population inversion, the cavity, and the stimulated emission of radiation. All of that physics just to give you that tiny little dot of light. So if you've got any questions about that, you can actually send them in via the via the page on Google+, which some of you might be watching it there, and we'll cover those afterwards. Sonia, have you got any questions about lasers?
Yeah. So one of the things I was thinking that you said at the end there was the fact that lasers are sort of all around us, and yet actually they sound like they were very complicated to make. And I wonder, like, how many other physics inventions are just around us in everyday life that actually took a lot of effort to make in the first place.
Well, I think the big one would be transistors, because everything that we have that has any sort of computing power these days will have a ridiculous number of transistors actually inside the chips. And a transistor is just something so that it'll either let a current through or not, depending on another signal which is going to it. So you can actually then start building logic gates like AND and OR gates, which determine whether signals get through, and basically then you can start performing all the logic that a computer needs to actually run. But to actually really understand what's going on in a transistor, you need to look at the quantum physics of semiconductors, which are particular types of material where they have, rather than just like individual levels for the electrons, they have what we call bands, but with a small gap in between these two bands. So the electrons can have all these energies here or all these energies up here, and there's just a thin gap in the middle. And it's that thin gap that means that we can actually do interesting engineering with them and set up situations where the electrons can jump over that gap and actually exist in the higher band and flow and make a current and actually give us our computing power. Thank you, Sonia. So we'll move on to you now.
Thank you.
What have you got for us this time?
I'm going to be talking about how plants avoid being eaten, with one very specific example, which we'll come to a little bit later in what I'm talking about. But, well, fundamentally, we know that plants don't want to be eaten. They put a lot of work into photosynthesis so they can grow and reproduce, and they don't want some bumbling herbivore to come along and just destroy all their hard work. And this seems pretty reasonable, really. No creature wants to end up as someone else's dinner. And while animals might seem to be a bit more proactive in avoiding this fate, because they run away from their predators, plants aren't exactly just sitting there idly waiting for themselves to be munched up. They invest in defenses. And in fact, plants have a whole arsenal they can choose from, ranging from physical defenses, such as spines and thorns, to chemicals. And actually, the sheer number of different chemicals that plants can make is staggering. It really is a showcase of nature's diversity. We call the compounds, collectively, the secondary metabolites, because they're not part of the fundamental chemical reactions of respiration and photosynthesis that are the primary metabolic reactions that you need to stay alive. And I should point out, not all of the secondary metabolites are defense chemicals. They actually fill a huge variety of roles within the plant. For example, you get anthocyanins, and they are used as pigment molecules. They give flowers their color and an appealing appearance to pollinators, particularly flowers that are purples and pinks are due to anthocyanins. And even if the chemicals are defense chemicals, they aren't necessarily deadly, depending on who you are and how large the dose is. For example, you've got limonene in lemons, menthol in mint. Both of those successfully keep insects away, but they're not exactly deadly to humans. In fact, we tend to quite like the taste of menthol. And things like digoxin from the poisonous foxglove can be used to treat various heart conditions in humans at a low dosage. But of course, making these secondary metabolites, or in fact defenses of any sort, has a cost to the plant. They require resources, carbon, nitrogen, energy, to make these defenses. And as a result, the plant has to effectively choose how to allocate its precious resources, either to more growth, because that's going to allow it to compete better with the other plants in its environment, or to defend what it has already made. And plant scientists have come up with a hypothesis to predict whether or not a plant will invest in defenses. And it's termed the scarcity accessibility hypothesis. And the name really does give you a bit of a hint as to what's going on here. So it was first thought that where resources were scarce, a plant would invest in defenses, regardless of what sort of plant it was, because effectively, where resources were scarce, they were it artificially elevated their value. So losing any part of a plant would be more costly, effectively, to replace. But the thing is that actually that doesn't tell the whole story. And so they've refined the hypothesis to include a few more niche cases. And one of the things that comes from this is actually a subtle difference. It's not so much the scarcity of resources to the plant, it's the scarcity of plants to herbivores that are interested in eating them. And really, it's all about the likelihood of the plant being consumed as to whether or not it will invest. And really, this is best illustrated with a couple of examples. So I have three, which will hopefully make the point nice and clear. So first of all, one that seems to actually support the original theory of just scarce resources causing defenses to be invested in. Cacti in a desert have spines. Most succulent plants in deserts are poisonous. And that's simply because while there are low nutrients, what that results in is there being very few edible plants about. So nutrients for herbivores are scarce. And the plants that do grow are very accessible. They're blindingly obvious if you see a cacti in the middle of a desert. So they have to defend themselves. In contrast, we can look at the rainforests. Rainforests have a lot of life going on in them. They are generally very nutrient rich. They've got a decent amount of water, kind of completely the opposite to our desert example before. And based on resources alone, you wouldn't expect to see any defenses. But that's obviously not the case. There are lots of climbing plants and small trees that occupy gaps in particular. And they do invest in defenses. And it's one of those that I'll be coming back to later as the example that I want to spend a bit more time. But effectively, the reason that these end up investing in defenses is that although a rainforest is a nutrient-rich environment, most of the nutrients that herbivores would be interested in are locked away in the canopies of the rainforest. And a lot of these herbivores are deer, sort of low browsing animals that can't reach the tops of tall trees. So even though the nutrients are there in the environment, they are inaccessible. So they are effectively scarce for a different reason. And so you've got your low growing shrubs, anything that's trying to start out in life in a gap where a tall tree has fallen due to old age. Those are incredibly accessible in a nutrient scarce environment, and so they have to invest in defenses. And just to grab an example from Britain as well, scarcity can be due to seasonal factors rather than an all year round sort of thing. Our woodlands here are deciduous, so they lose their leaves in the winter, and in fact there's a lot of there's a complete lack really of vegetation available in our woodlands over winter. They're very bare. A few plants are still around, things like the European holly and its characteristic prickly leaves and poisonous berries that we see all over Christmas cards and in decorations exist because it is available when nutrients are scarce in that environment, even though during the summer it's not a nutrient-poor environment. So, as I just said, in those examples, I mentioned we'd come back to one particular climbing plant. And that's because of a paper just published about this plant that has quite a remarkable defense mechanism, really, for a plant. When we think about plant defenses, we often think about the spines, thorns, chemicals that I mentioned earlier. What doesn't immediately spring to mind is camouflage. And this defense of just blending into the background is much more common among animals, perhaps because, for the most part, plants are the background. And so to blend into the background for a plant simply needs to pretend to be another plant. And there are a few species that do this. But the paper is about a particular woody vine called Bocquila trifoliata that grows in the temperate rainforests of South America. And it's pulled off the impressive feat of mimicking not just one host, but multiple different host plants. We don't often stop to think about sort of the diversity of leaf shapes and sizes, but they really do vary a lot. And how they grow on any given plant is actually defined by some quite strict developmental planning that determines exactly what they look like. And if you give a bit of thought to that complexity, the fact that a single individual vine can grow across several host trees and change how its leaves look depending on which host it's growing on is absolutely incredible. But is it the impersonation that is protecting the plant, or is it's a climbing vine? Is it simply climbing out of the reach of the herbivores? So the researchers who investigated this at a university in Chile tested it in a fairly simple manner, actually. They compared the herbivory between various different conditions. So first of all, they compared herbivory of the host plant leaves and the vine's leaves. And they found that actually they were eaten to a similar degree. So then they looked at vines growing sort of hanging free or on the forest floor in a very accessible area and no possibility of mimicking what it was growing on. And they found that those were eaten more than their mimicking counterparts. Okay, so that's great. It proves that we're getting the vines eaten more, but it could just be because of accessibility at this point. So the third really important category was that they laid vines on trunks of trees that had no other leaves on them. So they were the only foliage, even though they were climbing up, as in the first category. And this category was eaten more than either of the two previous categories. So clearly from this, growing up was not the solution to getting away from your herbivores. And it really was the mimicking the other plant that gave you a chance of that leaf being eaten rather than your own leaf, which was pretty impressive, really. Now, unfortunately, for now, that's all the detail we have, but I very much doubt that the story of this vine will end there in the future. The researchers who published the paper have yet to establish how the plant is able to see what the host leaves even look like, and we really don't know how it reprograms the developmental instructions to its own leaves. The photos in the paper show that it's able to mimic different numbers of lobes on leaves, even mimicking a sort of spike at the end of one of the host plants. It really can impersonate a vast variety of plants. So in the meantime, while we wait to find out what is causing this and how it works, hats off to this incredible plant impersonator.
Yeah, wow, that really is quite impressive amount of impersonation, because if you imagine similar things in the animal kingdom, just an animal trying to pretend to be several different animals, that just wouldn't work. You can just about get away with it through being a plant.
Yeah, well, one of the things that plants have in their favor is that we have determined growth. A human looks like a human, and that's sort of, we have 2 arms, 2 legs, whereas plants aren't like that. They can keep growing all over the place. So they can just keep growing. They have stem cells at the tips of every branch and every root, so they are able to grow into all sorts of shapes, which helps with impersonating multiple different things. But really how they do it is a very impressive mystery. Especially because the only previous cases of mimicry tend to be of things that are, say, parasitic plants, mistletoe, one of the Australian mistletoes that actually sort of gets heavily, it interacts a lot with its host plant, is able to mimic it, and it effectively fools pollinators into pollinating it as well. But that's via very close contact with the 2 plants, so you can see that there's a chance for exchange of chemicals there. Whereas they showed that there doesn't have to be direct contact for this vine. So it must be some sort of volatile chemical that's in the air that's allowing it to work out what to change to. And yeah, I would be very excited to see how it works.
And you're saying it could basically imitate several different plants with different kinds of leaves. Could you give us a bit more of a description of what those are? Because you said one of them there was a spike, but you didn't really go into much detail.
Okay, well, I can attempt to show the photo, but I don't know if that will work very well. Let's see, we can try. If not, I can try and describe it a bit more instead. So you can see some small leaves in the middle there, and then this way you've got sort of more heart-shaped leaves, and they're a lot bigger, got longer leaves. The one in the middle here, they're pointing with an arrow to the slight tip, and it's got a spike on the end of it that you can't really see, I'm afraid. And there's a whole load more of just very long leaves. You might have spotted that they're different colors, the darkness of the green changes a lot as well. So there is a lot changing between the different leaves it's managing to impersonate.
Yeah, so there's really a lot going on there, and hopefully we'll be able to put some links up in the description of this video afterwards, and on the Sci Cam on the Sci Cam blog, which is the next important bit of the show, because we are starting a blog which will go out weekly. What we're going to do is we're going to keep on doing our shows like this about once a month. In fact, we're going to try and do them on the second Tuesday of every month, keeping it at 7 p.m. local time here in the UK, and that will continue on as normal. But every other Tuesday in the month, apart from that, we will put a blog post up, which may be about something that's been in the previous episode, or it might be entirely unrelated. It's just some more interesting science that we want to tell you about. And the first post, which is just kind of an introduction, is up now. So if you go to www.contrarythoughts.com/sci-cam, it's a long one, so that's going to be going in the comments to this video as well. That's contrarythoughts.com/sci-cam, and you'll be able to follow our blog there. So I hope you all enjoy that too. But that's all we've got time for. So thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed finding out about lasers and plant mimicry. Two wonders you might not have particularly thought about before, especially the plants, because yeah, I'd never heard of that. It sounds like some very, very new research.
Yeah, it came out just this year. To be honest, how they noticed that there was a plant that was actually a different plant, that takes some impressive field research there.
Yeah. So thank you very much, and as I said, we'll be back in a month's time on the second Tuesday of the month. And until then, enjoy the vlog. Thank you very much, Sonia.
Bye.
Bye-bye.